will say, oh, no, 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 we get rumors all the time. Penelope's always asking strangers who show up, right? And there's always some fine tale, some codger, old codger, who comes up with a fine tale. He says it, my master? Well, no doubt the dogs and wheeling birds have ripped the skin from his ribs by now. His life is through, or fish have picked him clean at sea, and the man's bones lie piled up on the mainland, buried deep in sand. He's dead and quick observation. Do you remember when Priam in the Iliad was saying to his son Hector, please don't go fight against Achilles, because if you do, you're going to die. And then what will happen to Troy? It will fall. And then what will happen to me? The dogs will eat at my body. And he even mentions how tragic it is when the dogs tear up the man's genitals. It's a powerful, powerful statement. You'll remember in the same scene that Hecuba, the wife of Priam, the mother of Hector, will in fact show her breast and say, please, do you remember, I fed you from this breast. Don't go out there and die against the kids. We got the same kind of reminiscence here by Eumaeus, who says, my master's probably been eaten by dogs. Note the irony, just a few moments ago, dogs actually almost ate his master, right? Yeah, Homer loves this kind of irony as we're pointing it out, right? He says, never another master will be as kind as Odysseus was. I'll never find another one. He says, much I grieve for them, much I long to lay my eyes on them, set foot on the old soil. It's longing for him that wrings my heart. And then he finally says it, Odysseus, lost and gone. That man, old friend, far away as he is, I can scarcely bear to say his name aloud. So deeply he loved me, cared for me so deeply. Worlds away as he is, I call him master, brother. Now, Marx would have a lot to say about this kind of thing, that we, people in power, will often invent stories to make themselves feel somehow like it's okay that they subjugate people. Here, he says, my master is also my brother. What's fascinating about this is that when Athena said, go to Eumaeus, the swineherd, you have no sense that Odysseus says, oh yeah, I know him, sure. But here, Eumaeus talks about Odysseus as if they are very, very close, right? Odysseus, we're told, will answer and come back. Odysseus is on his way. He's coming, right? And he even says it, Odysseus says it at line 181, I hate that man like the very gates of death who, ground down by poverty, stoops to peddling lies. It's a dark irony that he would say this, right? He says, I swear by Zeus, the first of all the gods, by this table of hospitality here, my host, by Odysseus' hearth, where I have come for help, all will come to pass. I swear exactly as I say. In other words, true. This very month, just as the old moon dies and the new moon rises into life, Odysseus will return. He will come home and take revenge on any man who offends his wedded wife and princely son. Eumaeus can't have any of it. He says, yeah, never, right? And then he says, he mentions Telemachus, and he says, well, about Telemachus at line 200, how I grieve for Telemachus now, I can't stop. Odysseus' son, right? He says, the gods reared him like a fine young tree. And I often said, in the ranks of men, he'll match his father, his own dear father, amazing in build and looks, that boy. But all of a sudden, a god wrecks his sense of balance. God or man, no matter. Off he's gone, Telemachus, to catch some news of his father down to holy Pylos. And now those gallant suitors lie in wait for him, sailing home to tear the royal line of Odysseus out of Ithaca, root and branch, good name and all. Enough, he says, let him pass too. Whether he's trapped or the hand of Zeus will pull him through alive. Now, it's at this point I want to point out something that's fascinating. Think about this. Telemachus is sitting right now, we're going to find this out in the next book, he's sitting right now in Menelaus' castle with Helen, and they are having a great time. Athena has already told Odysseus as much. Notice the reference here has got to pain Odysseus. He's never seen his son, his only son. We think about Achilles and his father Peleus, and Achilles saying, I'm never going to be able to see my father again because he will die at the walls of Troy. We have a similar kind of dynamic at play here. We've got Odysseus, the old father, who wants to see his son, but won't get to see his son for a while. Of course, that reuniting of Odysseus with Telemachus, our poet is setting us up for that. Then Eumaeus will ask him. He says, come, old soldier, tell me the story of your troubles. Tell me truly, too. I'd like to know it well. Who are you? And when we hear this question, we realize this is the Montour question all the way through the Odyssey. Who are you? And at the very end, when the suitors want to know, who are you? and Odysseus is drawing back that bow to jack them, they'll still be asking, who are you? It's the question of the Odyssey. Who are you? Where are you from? Your city, your parents? What sort of vessel brought you? Why did the sailors land you here in Ithaca? Who did they say they are? I hardly think you came this way on foot. Now, let's just point out, Eumaeus asked for a story. I have said that our study at AP suggests that we are the stories we tell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. We get this idea very much clearly from the Odyssey. It is a story of stories. It is a poem of poems. We saw this with our comments on Demodocus, the great blind poet. And here, Eumaeus is going to ask for a story. Odysseus is going to serve up a story, and in so doing, for your notes, he will return us back to the Iliad, and more particularly to the great man Nestor, who loves to tell stories, loves to tell these long kinds of statements. And in many ways, we're going to hear some echoes of Nestor, line for line, in fact. Odysseus will actually use some of the lines of Nestor himself, right, as he goes forward. We're told, the great teller of tales, line 220, returned at length. My story, the whole truth, reminding us that just a few lines ago he said that he hates as the gates of death. And of course we think about that Iliad 9 line that Achilles said, I hate that man as the gates of death, that says one thing and hides another in his heart, right? My story, the whole truth, I'm glad to tell it all. If only the two of us had food and mellow wine, he says, to last us long, here in your shelter now, for us to sup on undisturbed while others take the work of the world in hand. I could easily spend all the year and never reach the end of my endless story. He said the same thing to the Phaeacians, right? All the heartbreaking trials I struggled through, the gods willed it so. We're back to the blame of the gods in the opening of Odyssey 1. But then he starts out on this long story that just goes hundreds of lines. And the obvious question is, why do we have to have this long story? I think there's a couple of really important reasons here. One is, let's put it in our notes, our poet wants to let us know that Odysseus has this genius gift for weaving. It's been a poem about weaving, and Odysseus can weave a story unlike anybody else. That is to say, Odysseus complimented Demodocus, the great poet bard, for weaving a story. Odysseus plays the exact same game. It's quite remarkable. Number two, Odysseus, in the story that he is about to tell, will drop all kinds of hints for an acute listener to realize he is telling some truth in telling the lie, in telling the story. Let's go through the story really quickly, right? He says, I started in Crete. He begins with his mother and his father, but he says, I was treated unfairly by my brothers. However, I won a wife. And then he says, but now, at line 248, my heyday's gone. I've had my share of blows. And yet a really important line, yet, look hard at the husk and you'll still see, I think, the grain that gave it life. What a great line. I mean, here's Odysseus changed into an old man, and he says, if you look closely, you should be able to find me there. In other words, Tennyson will take this to heart, and he will say, this may be the real Odysseus. That although he claims that he wants to get back home to his wife Penelope, you get a sense that he's probably going to go on another adventure, which is exactly what we hear from here, right? He says, by heaven, Ares gave me courage, Athena too, to break the ranks of men wide open once in the old days, whenever I picked my troops and formed an ambush. And in others he says, I love to fight. I was courageous. He said, I didn't like agriculture, but I loved war and I loved battle, he says. And a really important line, he says, I loved them all. God planted that love inside me, the love of fighting, the love of travel. Each man delights in the work that suits him best. It's a great line. I think it's an important line because Odysseus loves to tell stories, just like Demodocus, the great poet. He says, why? Long before we Achaeans ever camped at Troy, taking us back to Troy, he says, 9 commands I led out in deep seas. He says, I got all kinds of teammate. He said, I walked among the Cretans, honored and feared as well, right? Just like Odysseus will be at the end of this book. He takes us back to Troy. He said there was no way out. I had to go to Troy. And for 9 years we fought at Troy. But he says, after Troy, no more than a month, he says, at line 278. No more than a month I stayed at home, taking joy in my children, loyal wife, lovely plunder. By the way, notice, loyal wife. But a spirit in me urged. This is like Socrates' daimon, right, that we hear about when he mentions it in Plato's Apology. Set sail for Egypt, fit out ships, take crews of seasoned heroes. So he says, off I left for Egypt. There, with my troops, we were at the Nile. He sends men out to scout, just like Odysseus will in his other stories and his flashback stories. But he says, my reckless sailors, reminding us that, of course, he did have reckless sailors, they decide to plunder, just like the city of these Cicones, and that we saw in Book 9. And then he says, they dragged off the women and the children, my warriors did, which led to a major fight. And he said, all my men got slaughtered. He said, right at the moment when I was ready to be slaughtered, I went and supplicated the king of Egypt. He saved my life for 7 years. Note, he was on 7 years on Calypso's island. For 7 years, he says, I was in Egypt. Then a Phoenician came along. He stays for a year with the Phoenician. Then the Phoenician decides that he wants to take him somewhere else. Notice here, Odysseus as this world traveler, right? First it's to Egypt, then it's to Phoenicia, and then this Phoenician's going to take him to Libya. Only what he wants to do, this Phoenician, is he really wants to sell Odysseus, and yet Odysseus says, I had no real choice, at line 333. I had no real choice, and so I boarded with him, yes, and the ship ran on, but then Zeus sends this nasty storm, and the exact same language of Book 12, line 450 is used. Then in the same breath, Zeus hit the craft with a lightning bolt and thunder. Round she spun, reeling under the impact, filled with reeking brimstone, shipmates pitching out of her, bobbing around like seahawks, swept along by the breakers, past the trim black hole, and the god cut short their journey home forever. It's the exact same lines after Odysseus' men ate the forbidden cattle on the island of the sun god. Now, what is going on here? Let me point out something to you. We read this poem. We know how to go back. For example, I just said, hey, Book 12, line 450, for example. But when the poem was originally recited, it's not being read, it's being listened to. And so the poet can get away with repeating lines like this because a good listener is going to say, oh, that kind of reminds me of the other story that he told. He's making up the story. I wonder if he was making up that story and how much of it. See how it works. Zeus saves him. 10 days he floats at sea. Just like the Phaeacians, he lands at Thesprotia, where Phaedon is his salvation, right? And then he says, it's there at Thesprotia that he says, I got first wind, at line 363, of him, Odysseus. The king told me he'd hosted the man in style, befriended him on his way home to native land, and showed me all the treasure Odysseus had amassed. Bronze and gold and plenty of hard-wrought iron, enough to last the man in 10 generations of his heirs. So great the wealth stored up for him in the king's vaults. But, he says, Odysseus, he made clear, was off at Dodona then, to hear the will of Zeus that rustles forth from the god's tall, leafy oak. How should he return, after all the years away, to his own green land of Ithaca? Open or in secret? Phaedon swore to me, what's more, as the princely men poured out libations in his house, the ships hauled down and the crew set sail to take Odysseus home to native land. From there, he says, he was able to catch a cutter headed towards Dulcian. So in other words, notice again our traveler. But then those guys, they have a scheme to sell him off. They're going to trade him off as a slave. Why, he says, I have these rags on is because they changed my clothes and made me put on these rags. And then we ended up in Ithaca. But he says he was blessed by the gods, for they were allowed him to get out of the ropes that he was in. He escapes, he hides on Ithaca, they leave, and he says finally, it's like work for the gods to help, and they brought me here, the homestead of a man who knows the world, so he says about himself, knows the world. So it seems to be to me my lot that I'll live on, right? This idea of a man that knows the world, 407, 408, this is, of course, the Ulysses that Tennyson understands and wants to celebrate. Then we come back to this again. Eumaeus says, so much misery, he says. Well, I know, he says, of my good Lord's return, how the gods detested him with a vengeance, never letting him go under fighting Trojans or die in the arms of loved ones once he'd wound down the long coil of war. That long coil of war we remember from the Iliad. In other words, he says, there isn't any way. Then all, he says, united Achaea would have raised Odysseus' tomb, and he'd have won his son great fame for years to come, that is to say, Cleos. Instead, well, not so much. And in fact, Eumaeus says, I was once fooled by an Aetolian who told me that he had killed a man, wandered over the face of the earth, that he had seen Odysseus, etc., etc. None of it was true. He said, so, you old misery, seeing a god has led you here to me, at line 438, don't try to charm me now. Don't spellbind me with lies. Never for that will I respect you, treat you kindly. No, it's my fear of Zeus, the god of guests, and because I pity you. That's why he says he shows it to you. Odysseus will come back and say, what a skeptic you are. I'll suggest an oath, he says. How about this? I'll die if it's not the case that Odysseus is coming back. And again, Eumaeus says, forget about it. All the other swine herders are showing up. Let's eat. He kills one more pig. The other herdsmen are there. Let's enjoy the fattest hog, he says. And then he makes a prayer as he gets ready to slaughter the hog. And he says it, bring him home. So notice Eumaeus is kind of stuck between believing on the one hand he's dead, and on the other hand, bring him home. Bring him home, our wise Odysseus, home at last. And of course this bring him home reminds us of that famous song from the opera Les Mis, doesn't it, right? Then they kill the hog. Odysseus gets the best cut. And we're told the man for all occasions, at line 498, thanked his host. Right? He says, I pray, Eumaeus, you'll be as dear to Father Zeus as you are to me, a man in my condition. You honor me by giving me your best. And then we're told, you, replied in kind, Eumaeus, swineherder, at line 503, eat, my strange new friend. Enjoy it now. It's all we have to offer. As for Father Zeus, one thing he will give, and another thing he'll hold back. This sounds very much like Achilles talking about Zeus's 2 jars when he's talking to Priam in Iliad 24. Remember, he says, whatever his pleasures, all things are in his power. He burned choice parts of the gods who never die, and pouring glistening wine in full libation, placed the cup in his guest's hands. Odysseus, raider of cities, and down he sat to his own share. Note the ironic line that the king of Ithaca is sitting in a hut, eating the little tiny bit of meat that can be given to him. The slave, Eumaeus, has a slave, right, and he will serve, and then it's time for bed, and then it's cold. And then we have the second amazingly interesting and intricate little story. And Odysseus will say, listen, Eumaeus and all you comrades here, allow me to sing my praises for a moment, which is exactly what he's about to do, because he's going to tell a story about Odysseus. Say it's the wine that leads me on, the old wine, or the wild wine that sets the wisest man to sing at the top of his lungs, laugh like a fool, it drives the man to dancing. It even tempts him to blurt out stories better never told. But now that I'm sounding off, I can't hold back. This is a good line. I mean, it says Odysseus can't hold back. He's got to tell his stories. Oh, he's sounding very much like Nestor in the Iliad. Oh, make me young again, and the strength inside me steady as a rock, just as I was that day we sprang a sudden ambush against the Trojans. Odysseus led the raid with Atreus' son Menelaus. Ironic, because Menelaus is now sitting with Telemachus. And he tells this story about how they were out at night, and they were right next to the walls of Troy, and this beggar had forgotten his cloak, and so he needed a cloak. And so he speaks to Odysseus, and we're told at line 558, I came out half dressed, he says to Odysseus. Now there's no escape. I hadn't finished. A thought flashed in his mind, Odysseus. No one should touch that man at plots. No one could touch that man at plots or battles. He compliments himself by saying, that Odysseus was the greatest thinker I ever met. And he comes back and he says, don't worry about it. And so he shouts out or whispers out to the men, I need somebody to go back and talk to Agamemnon. Theos will jump up, leave his cloak, allowing the Odysseus beggar to have a cloak, and so he slept. And then he says it again at line 570, oh, make me young again, and the strength inside me steady as a rock. Right? Well, as finally they get the message, they give him a cloak. Eumaeus will say, when Telemachus comes back, he'll give you a change of clothes. I can't give you that, but I will give you a bed to sleep in. And Odysseus will go to sleep. Odysseus sleeps with the young hands next to the fire. But we're told that Eumaeus cared so much for his absent master's goods that he goes out and he sleeps outside with the pigs, guarding the pigs. It's a remarkable book to celebrate the fact that Eumaeus, while Odysseus is away, is still showing him respect. Let's jump level 2 and 3 quickly. Odysseus, of course, is the weaver. He is also the traveler. And this love of travel is really in many ways born of this story, right? Another message. Things are not always what they appear. Eumaeus has no idea he's talking to the king of Ithaca and Odysseus, right? How about this one? Even the poorest, this was not lost on the Greeks when they heard the story, even the poorest can show zinnia, right? Shows him proper zinnia, as opposed to those suitors who do not. Eumaeus, of course, another message, is loyal, even though the master is absent, right? Like working hard, even if the boss is gone, for example. At 2b, symbolism. Well, obviously, Odysseus here is symbolized as the great storyteller and the great journeyer. They go kind of in together, right? Also, we said it, that symbol of the wooden cup, right? Which shows that Eumaeus is a poor man. The irony, well, is of course that Eumaeus has no idea he is actually talking to Odysseus. We're going to see this a lot in texts, right? In movies, video games, disguise, where someone is different than who they appear to be or whatever, right? Let's jump to 3a. Speaking of relationship to other texts. In the Iliad, of course, here we have the return of Nestor, don't we? And it's just like in Book 3 of the Odyssey. And of course, in the Iliad, Nestor loves to tell those stories, right? Odysseus, by the way, in the Iliad, think about that. There's not a lot about him. But here, of course, in this poem, we have multiple layers of Odysseus. Here, we get a different picture of Odysseus. The Odysseus, notice, that is an old man telling stories that are in fact lies. The hero in disguise to get information is famous. Shakespeare uses it in Henry V when he walks among his troops to try and figure out where they stand. We're going to see this so much. Jot down for you that text where someone is incognito, someone is not who they appear to be. Of course, Shakespeare plays the same game in an interesting way in the play Hamlet, where Hamlet takes on an antic disposition. He pretends like he's crazy to be able to get information. What's the show that you like? Are you familiar with this? The show where the boss dresses up so that he's just like, or she's just like a normal worker, but then works alongside to get information? What's the one that you like about that? Finally, at 3b, what was a time that you told a great story for a purpose? You had a purpose behind the story. It wasn't a true story, but you told a great story for a purpose. What was a time you were fooled by somebody in disguise? That's an interesting question. What was a time when you spied on someone else? And what are your thoughts about that? Odysseus is kind of spying on Eumaeus. He's testing him in some way, the poem tells us. What was a time you worked hard? How about this one? What was a time you worked hard even when no one, like the boss, was watching? I always go back to that classic text of Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, where he tells the story of how he was given the job of sweeping the floor, and the master, the boss man, went away and he swept the floor and he said, I know I can do it better. And he swept it again and he said, I know I can even do it better than that. And he did it one more time, so that when boss man came back, he said, this is amazing, I'll give you a job. What a fascinating story. What a suggestion here as well. Eumaeus is the classic exemplar of this. All right, that's book 14. We now